Next speaker, Dr. Christian Siderius. And yeah, the screen is yours, Christian.
Thank you, RNG. Thank you, ICIMOD, and thank you, partners, for giving me the opportunity to speak at this webinar. I'll briefly introduce or discuss some of the issues around quantifying the water, energy, food, environment nexus, with examples from international studies and closing with an example in the HKH or the wider HKH downstream region. So how to quantify the nexus? Well, if you go into the literature, you will see many review papers describing what is the nexus, how should we apply it, but there's actually little quantification. It's not that we don't have the techniques. We have life cycle analysis tools for product type analysis. We have input-output tables for more economic analysis. And when it comes to basin assessments, we have optimization techniques that have been developed since the 1990s, more or less. And they are based on a description of hydrology, so they approach it more from the water side, but they compare added value between different sectors, energy, sometimes environment, water, agriculture. I think what is an interesting development over the past years with these technologies is that rather than optimizing based on purely the financial value, we see that there's new technologies based on sort of, you could say, Google search techniques that make it possible to evaluate different indicators with completely different characteristics. As an example, you could compare the number of elephants impacted by a hydropower dam, and you could compare that with the value of hydropower versus the cost of upstream agricultural development. Now, I mean, that is still tricky, but at least you don't have to translate everything to a single US dollar, a single rupee value. And I think that multi-objective optimization is quite an interesting development when it comes to the water, energy, food, environment nexus type of work. Now, these type of methodologies are complex. They take time to set up. So you have to be careful when do you apply them, when do they really add value. But I think what I've learned of what I see from working with them is that they can really add sort of an insight in the relevance. What is the trade-offs, or what are the trade-offs that are really the most significant? Maybe some other interactions between sectors are mainly synergies. They are important, you shouldn't forget them, but maybe most of the energies should go in trying to understand trade-offs and trying to find ways to minimize those trade-offs. What you do see is that the focus of these type of studies have mostly been on water and energy trade-offs, so the impact of hydropower on downstream flows, or the impact of water availability on hydropower. And so I think there is a need to open that up and not to look only at two-sector interaction, but to really look at the complexity of the interaction, as was also highlighted in the previous slide, or in the previous presentation. To give you 3 examples from work that I've been doing internationally, to start quickly with the Nile basin. Many of you might know it, but the issue there is that there's quite some political tension between upstream and downstream riparians, with Ethiopia building a big hydropower dam and Egypt and Sudan fearing that it will impact their irrigation water supply. The thing is, if you focus purely on the river system, energy, irrigation, you will only see trade-offs. You will only see impacts. None of the countries can get more water without impact the other. What is interesting, if you zoom out and you ask the question, okay, what is really important in 10, 20 years time in terms of food security, in providing more food to a growing population, more energy, then you see that actually the real potential is still in the rain-fed areas upstream that are underdeveloped because of conflict, because of less investments. If you take that into account, you can sort of see much more opportunities to cooperate, because Egypt, for example, has a very strong food processing industry. And rather than producing everything themselves and holding on to all the irrigation water that flows downstream now, they might actually have much more opportunity if they cooperated with upstream countries. So this is one example where you should, at the beginning of your study, setting it up, or in the beginning of your workshops sequence, you should realize, okay, what is the scope that I think is needed, or how broadly should we address the issue? Second insight, I think one thing is never to underestimate the environment. And I mean this also in terms of economic value, even though it's often hard to quantify the value of ecosystems. And this is an example from the Rufiji basin, where I worked the last 4 years together with colleagues at the London School of Economics and with Morogoro University. And here in Tanzania, they are building currently one of the biggest hydropower dams in Africa. And that threatens to impact strongly downstream environment, the downstream delta ecosystem. And here you see a picture. It's maybe not the most promising picture because of the dead trees, but there's a lot of wildlife with a lot of tourism potential, which is currently not exploited yet. And what you see here is that analyzing trade-offs between energy production, potential energy production, agriculture development upstream and downstream, and tourism, we see that there is a small positive synergies, but only if you would prioritize the value of ecosystems, even in dry years. And at the moment, what we see in the whole discussion and in the sort of planning is that it's the energy department, the Ministry of Agriculture, or the Ministry of Energy that is taking the lead. And at the moment, it seems that there's not enough attention to take into account these other values, which are actually much higher if you look at a volumetric basis per cubic meter of water. A third example from a study for Kuwait and the wider Gulf region is to consider clearly your boundaries. What are you looking at spatially? Are you looking at just one region, one country, or should you look broader and take into account international linkages? And what we see for the Gulf is that actually within countries, trade-offs are fairly limited, even though it's obviously very dry. There's not much food production in many of these countries, but there never has. So that is not really a trade-off. What we see is that a country like Saudi Arabia has actually shut down most of its domestic food production when it comes to wheat, and has started to import a lot of food from abroad. Now, so they have reduced their domestic nexus by importing food elsewhere. And that links it to the nexus issues in other countries. For example, much of the rice imports originates from South Asia, where there, of course, are huge issues with groundwater depletion, as many of us know. And so when looking at these countries and their nexus issues, it's more an exposure to nexus problems elsewhere that might put them at risk. Also because in years with droughts, in years with high food prices and low energy prices, they actually spend really a lot of money in terms of their budget on food imports. And in the long run, that is not sustainable in the way they do it now.
2 minutes, Christian.
Yes, I'll finalize zooming in on the water, energy, food nexus and linking it to the SDGs in South Asia. This is a study I've been doing over the past 2 years. And when you try to link the sustainable development goals, one aspect that becomes very important is, of course, reducing poverty. And in this case, we've looked at the profitability of agriculture, in addition to looking at trade-offs between nutrition, energy used by pumping and irrigation water, and environmental downstream flows. Just to give you an impression of the scale of the analysis, this is a prototype. And so this is sort of the grid cells and the different hydropower dams, different irrigation dams that we include in this type of analysis for the basin. Now, it can go at a much higher resolution, but for the moment, this is on which we base the results. Just to give you an idea of the outcomes of this study for the Ganges and Brahmaputra basin, this is a parallel coordinate plot which illustrates the value that can be achieved for different indicators, for different sectors. And if you go to the top of the graph, that is the preferred value. So you would like to have as much profit for agriculture as possible. You would like to provide nutrition for as many people as possible and have as much hydropower, etc., as possible. And what this graph illustrates is when there is crossing lines in the form of an X, that means there is a very strong trade-off between these sectors. You can't have the maximum of one without affecting the other. And you see that within the Ganges and the Brahmaputra basins, there is a very strong trade-off between net profit in agriculture and the nutrition that can be grown. So the productivity, the production of agriculture. And that is because a lot of the agriculture production, especially rice production, is actually grown. Well, it's grown with a small operating profit, but it's actually grown at a net profit loss. And if farmers would choose not to crop that because they want to increase their net profit, then that would go at the cost of a lot of nutrition. And I well, I'm happy to explain more detail behind it, but this is an outcome or a way to visualize the outcomes. Another insight here is that actually the impact or the trade-off between hydropower and agriculture production is relatively modest. You can fairly easily reach high volumes of hydropower production, at least according to our model. And that's another insight. And that supports earlier studies by the World Bank, who found more or less the same. To close my presentation, in terms of insight, I think to come back to scope, when it comes to the HKH, clearly all water, energy, food, energy, environment sectors are important. But you have to ask yourself the questions, are all trade-offs really that strong between these sectors? And as I showed in the previous slide, maybe the trade-off between energy production and food production is not that strong, but certainly the trade-off between energy use for pumping food production is quite strong within the basin. I think variability is often underanalyzed in nexus studies, so I think it's very important to look at the impact, for example, in drought years, and some sectors are much more vulnerable to those impacts than others. And so they're just looking at mean values is sometimes risky because you might miss out on important trade-offs. Profitability is an aspect that doesn't come back in that many nexus studies that I know, but clearly in the HKH region, it's an important point. That links to the last one. I think when it's about boundaries, the HKH is not isolated or insulated from the downstream areas, nor is it isolated from, say, other regions, with, for example, with remittances. And such connections might mean that certain trade-offs, certain synergies are stronger or less strong than you would expect if you just zoom in on a narrow area. And I think that is important to take into account. Okay, thank you.
Great.
For those interested, there are a couple of papers. I don't know if the presentation is shared. Otherwise, I'm happy to send them.
Yeah, thank you, Christian. Thank you. Excellent presentation. I think as the importance of quantifying and how you should do it, right? And with some examples, particularly the last one, and some of the insights on what needs to be considered, right? Those 4 or 5 final points were very interesting.